Please, comments, questions.
So all three agree on one thing, and that is what you summed up with, namely that godliness is the goal, and without it, without that concept of godliness, one can be only moral and less than moral, and or at the most moral, but certainly possibly less than moral. But how do you harmonize all three? The first one, the Rambam says the intellect, which he acknowledges doesn't lead you to complete knowledge, that there are limits to seichel, to understanding. The Ramban is obsessed with not obsessed. I'm sorry. Focuses on the depth of understanding the reasons underneath the esoterica, which may even be beyond our intellect, and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is focusing on somehow. I couldn't grasp it because he's speaking only the way I heard it. You describe it as, we get a result when we act in a certain way in the fullness of fulfilling the mitzvah, that we receive a gift of that shows that we have done that transcendence. That they all talk about that transcendence, but in different ways.
So first of all, we don't have to reconcile them. That is, we'll recognize that they are indeed distinct tracks, and they can all be true in different manners and different aspects, and for each of us to internalize on different planes. And I don't think there's any problem with that. What I should have clarified further with respect to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is that in essence, what he stresses is the divine experience. In other words, the way you relate to the mitzvah is by doing it, by getting into it. And I think that the experiential focus is something that is epitomized in what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is telling us, and that we should well appreciate why that is so critical, because after all, at the end of the day, what the mitzvot are, more than anything else, is experiences. What you're supposed to do. So, says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the way you become godly is by getting into the experience. And to that extent, we should also appreciate that from his perspective, we could well understand the opposition to the quest for ta'amei mitzvot as reflecting the realization that if I obsess on cognition, then I'm experiencing less. You could say, well, I could try to understand and also experience, but there is, on some plane, I'm not going to say a zero-sum game, but a tension between these two, that is bringing to bear the intellect is often at the expense of simply viscerally experiencing. And what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wants us to do is experience. And again, each of the three, I will freely concede, is giving us a different track on just what becoming godly means. But as you note, there's an awful lot that the three have in common, even as each one can represent a distinct facet of that progression through which we become divine, godly.
But to take it, and I mean no disrespect, but to take it out of simply the intellectual understanding of the three positions into how do we, as they would say, these need to be inculcated in ourselves so as to approach that goal. How do I take those practically? I mean, you say they're different perspectives. So
if you're going to ask me how will you actualize the three, my answer undoubtedly is going to be on varying levels and in varying degrees. In other words, in as much as I'm deliberately choosing three giants. From my perspective, the three central pillars upon which the whole building stands. And we each construct our own personal building. We each are engaged for life in formulating our own Jewish philosophy as the basis of how we make sense of what the Torah tells us. And undoubtedly, we will each appropriate from these three authors and from other luminaries, I doubt greater, but certainly luminaries nonetheless, even if smaller ones, the guidance for how to seek that course toward godliness. And it's, from my perspective, completely legitimate for a person to say, well, I resonate more with what Rabbi Dali is saying, or I resonate more with what Rambam is saying, I resonate more with what Ramban is saying. And to actualize those somewhat distinct paradigms in varying degrees in one's life. I think that's not only completely legitimate, I think it's indispensable. We have to recognize that it's not going to be one size fits all. Just as Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and Rambam and Ramban each viewed our avodah, our service of God, in somewhat varying terms, so too every single one of us is going to view our own avodah in varying terms. And that process whereby each of us strives to construct our own Jewish philosophy will be a reflection of each of these propositions in varying degrees. And again, I think it's not only legitimate, I think it's indispensable. There is an irreducible level of subjectivity when it comes to thought. And we've discussed this on other occasions as well. I just want to stress this point. When we read in the Torah, Torah achat u'mishpat echad yeh lachem. You're supposed to have one teaching, one judgment. And what is indeed this imperative toward what strikes us as conformity? So my simple answer to the question is that what underlies the need for conformity in practice is the manifest objective of the Torah to establish a covenantal community. In a covenantal community, everyone is united by some essential undergirding of conformity in practice, because otherwise there's no community. And clearly the Torah is intent upon establishing a sense of community. So that pertains to deed. It doesn't pertain to thought. Torah Echad Mishpat Echad is precisely a summons for conformity in deed, but not in thought. And of course, it's in this vein that I always like to note, and we probably have discussed this in other contexts as well, that the principle Elu va'elu divrei Elokim chayim hen. These and those are the words of the living God. That principle is something that we encounter in the Gemara on exactly two occasions. The first place is in Tractate Eruvin on page 13b, and there it's referring to the dissension between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. And it's important to stress, there it is a divine echo that proclaims with respect to this dissension, these and those are the words of the living God, but the halacha is like Beit Hillel. The second place is in Tractate Gittin on page 6b. The Gemara presents to us a dissension between Rabbi Evyatar and Rabbi Yonatan pertaining to a subtlety with respect to the sordid tale that we read at the end of Sefer Shoftim, Pilegesh Begiv'ah. the concubine in Giv'ah. And there's again a dissension between Rabbi Aviatar and Rabbi Yonatan. The Gemara relates that Rabbi Aviatar runs into Eliyahu and he asks him, what's Holy and Blessed be He doing now? And Eliyahu responds, he is engaging in Pilegesh Begiv'ah. And what's he saying? He's saying, Eviatar, my son, says thus, and Yonatan, my son, says thus. And when Rabbi Eviatar exclaims in horror, Chas v'shalom, God forbid, is there any uncertainty in the realm of the divine? The response of Eliyahu is, Elu ve'elu divei Elokim chaimen. These and those are the words of the living God. And Eliyahu provides some kind of amalgam of Rabbi Aviatar and Rabbi Yonatan, which of course is neither of their approaches. But there certainly is no v'halacha ke, that the halacha accords with one or the other, because it's not a question of halacha. We might facilely have thought that Rabbi Aviatar and Rabbi Yonatan are debating a point of history, so there certainly must be one right answer. But on the contrary, from our perspective, since we're not historians, we view the historical narrative merely as means to learning a lesson. If you can learn lessons according to Rabbi Aviatar and learn other lessons according to Rabbi Yonatan, they're both right. And I don't need to say halacha like one or the other, because it's not a question of halacha. Whereas with respect to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, that's a halacha question. There has to be one right answer. So of course, what I'm getting at with all of this is that with respect to a bona fide halachic question, your question would be completely in place. There has to be a bottom line. What do I do? With respect to the realm of thought, not. There can be many right answers. In a similar vein, there's a passage in Tractate Megillah on page 15b, when the Gemara asks the question, why did Esther invite Haman to the banquet with Achashverosh? And there are a dozen different answers that are presented in succession in the Gemara, and the end of the passage is that Rabbi Baravua, one of the respondents to the question, also bumps into Eliyahu, and he asks Eliyahu, so who did Esther really have in mind? Which view? And Eliyahu's response, Gechulo Tanai u'Gechulo Amorai, like all of the Mishnaic sages and all the Talmudic sages. And I always like to comment on this passage. So we could, of course, understand this passage as as Esther is writing out the invitation. She's thinking to herself, okay, so now I'm going to have kavanah to Rabbi Eliezer, and now I'm going to have kavanah to Rabbi Yeshua, and I'm going to have kavanah to Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. And of course, we've been missing the point. That is, Eliyahu's answer is, if it's a cogent message, they're all right. They're all correct. And it doesn't have to be one right answer. Because we aren't dealing with a halachic question in which there has to be one quantified right answer and the others are rejected. Rather, on the contrary, we appreciate that in the realm of thought, everything that is a cogent answer is a right answer. And that's really the message of this passage. And I reiterate, getting back to our question, so we consider different vantage points of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Rambam, Ramban. Who's right? They're all right. As for who is more or potentially less relevant to a given individual, that individual will decide. And he doesn't have to reach one monolithic decision and run with it for the rest of his life either, because ultimately that process whereby each of us is summoned to construct our own Jewish philosophy is an ongoing one. It's not, okay, I did it yesterday and now I'm finished for life. On the contrary, on an ongoing basis, I strive to answer that question, to answer it over and over and over again anew. as I constantly reconstruct and rebuild my life on that subjective plane of thought. Again, with respect to halakha, it's a different question. Torah achat u'mishpat echad yeh lachem. There indeed, on some plane, it could still be personal expression of minhag, of chumrah. There are various dimensions that can be legitimate subjective expression in halakha as well. But for the most part, halakha needs to be rigorously codified. With respect to the realm of thought, there can be many right answers. By the way, that's not to exclude the existence of wrong answers. There can be an infinite number of wrong answers too, but there could still be multiple right answers as well.
Rabbi Eisen?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't open my camera right now, but maybe I'm missing something very basic here. But what I'm not getting is like why you would say we do X, Y, Z in order to make a person in order to make us moral people. If we're doing things to make us moral people, it's because those things are moral, right? So why don't you want to just you do them because they're the moral things to do?
But again, my
Why
whole
does it
point
have to
is,
be? Or
but
are
we're
you
going
saying
beyond morality. That is, if all we're going to talk about is becoming moral people, then we're still grounded in seeing being moral as the be all and end all of our humanity. And the whole
no? But I'm just saying that part of it, even that sentence, right? Like Nachon, I hear that part, but aside from the be all and end all, just that piece of it of doing something to make one moral. Like it's like doing I can't think of an example, but if you're doing something to make one moral, you're doing a moral thing, and we want to do moral thing. Like it I don't know why I'm having a hard time explaining that. Does it have to be that it has to do something to us, or that it's the right thing to do?
I think I'm getting what
Maybe.
you're saying. I hope I am. Well, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, the underlying premise, indeed, again, I'm going to reiterate the words of Parashat Ekev, that all the mitzvot on some plane are letov lach. Now, you're right. If we're going to see it ultimately on the level of self-aggrandizement, I'm going to be able to pat myself on the back because I'm keeping the mitzvot, then we really have a major problem in our fidelity to God and His will, because we should be aligning ourselves with what is right because it is right and not because of the effect that it's going to have on ourselves. But simultaneously, it's important for us to appreciate on some level those are inseparable. And the way I could perhaps best express that is the realization, as we noted, and we discussed this in the previous unit, that the Gemara in Tractate Avodah Zarah on page 19a, in commenting on the second verse of Tehillim, remember, Ki'im b'Torat Hashem chevtzo v'Torato yehegeh imam b'layla. His desire is in the Torah of God, and His Torah He articulates day and night. And the grammatical ambiguity, and His Torah He articulates day and night. Whose Torah? And the answer that Rava gives us in, again, Tractate Avodah Zarah, page 19a, that we're referring to the Torah of the person who's studying it. That ultimately the Torah needs to transition from being only the Torah of God to being the Torah of the person. And while again, one might say, well, isn't that excessively highlighting the I? On some plane, my response is going to be indispensably so, because we do have that subjective perspective, and it's important for us to appreciate that the effect of Torah is transformative with respect to ourselves. And that's not merely an acceptable thing, that's a positive thing. Maybe a good way of illustrating this point is, there is a well-known discussion in the introduction to the Eglei Tal of the Sakhachover with respect to whether one should have enjoyment in engaging in study of Torah or not, where the perspective that he feels compelled to combat is that if one is studying Torah truly for its own sake, then one shouldn't enjoy it. One should do it in a manner that is completely dry, unpalatable, unpleasurable, because that means you're doing it for its own sake. And he goes to battle against that perspective. He says, on the contrary, part of the lishma is the enjoyment. And one might ask, what should that be? That is, on the contrary, if you're enjoying it, then it's not for its own sake, right? But no, it's important for us to appreciate. We indeed believe that the ultimate import of the Torah should be totally transformative. We should be transformed through the Torah. And in the same vein, then, that Rava emphasizes that the Torah needs to transition from being only the Torah of God to also being my Torah, is in precisely the same vein that the Gemara on the same page, check it out, page 19a, also gives us the exposition on the same verse, in the second verse of Tehillim. His desire is in the Torah of God. A person only learns Torah where his heart desires. I'm going to be transformed. The fact that I desire it isn't an impediment. On the contrary, it is a crucial aspect of my really getting into the effect that Torah is having on every fiber of my being. That's not a negative. That's crucial. Because at the end of the day, you're right, it's important for us to do that moral act because of the beneficiary of that moral act, the person on behalf of whom we're behaving. That's undoubtedly true, but at the same time, not at all incidentally, when the Talmud discusses, famously at the end of the first chapter of Kiddushin, what is greater, Talmud or Ma'aseh, study or deed? So what is ultimately the answer in the Gemara? Talmud gadol sheha Talmud mevi lidei Ma'aseh. That study is greater because it leads to deed. And we should see what the implications of that statement are. Because it leads to deed, and what if it doesn't lead to deed? And the obvious answer to that question is, it doesn't lead to deed, it's not real Talmud. Real Talmud necessarily is transformative. Now, what does that mean? If the only thing we would be studying would be halakha ma'aseh, then we, of course, could, on a facile plane, understand how we studied the halakha and we practiced the halakha. But that's not what the Gemara is telling you. It's telling you that when you really study with every fiber of your being, and you're engaging that process whereby Torah starts out being Torah of God, but ultimately becomes my Torah, I take possession of it. I become transformed by it. Inevitably, Talmud Gadol Sheh Talmud B'Vili Maseh, study is greater because it leads to deed, because I'm a different person now. Of course, if I'm a different person, everything I do is going to be different. And if that doesn't happen, then I'm not really interfacing with Torah. Not at all incidentally, the custom to study the tractate of ethics of the fathers on the Shabbatot between Pesach and Shavuot is a relatively venerable one. It dates back to the time of the Geonim. Just in the Mishnaic tractate of ethics of the fathers, there are only 5 chapters. And there are at minimum 6 Shabbatot between Pesach and Shavuot. So, through a fascinating, if you will, process of literary accretion, from various baraitot, material that had been left external to the Mishnah, a 6th chapter was fashioned for studying on the Shabbat immediately prior to Shavuot. And that 6th chapter is all about study of Torah. And it has a name. And what's the name of that chapter? It's not the chapter of studying Torah. It's Perek Kinyan Torah, the chapter of acquiring Torah. Because Torah isn't something you study, and it's not even something that you do. It's something that you acquire. It's something that you internalize. It's something that needs to transform you as a person. And if it doesn't transform you as a person, then on some plane, the study is of little avail and the practice is of little avail. Because the real transformation has to happen within. Like consequence of that transformation, that acquisition of Torah, indeed, I am now a different person and everything that I do is going to be different. But it needs to be in that direction because ultimately that's the way Torah is going to transform not only myself, by extension, the whole world. So I hope I understood the question correctly.
Amen. No, I think you answered my question and thank you. And I got what you said, but you just introduced another piece of it that I didn't get all along because I didn't get like when you're saying like a person keeps the mitzvot in order to make them a moral person. I didn't get this extra piece of the person doing it in order for it to make them a moral person. And I'm like a little bit surprised at that. I'm curious, like what people, like what percentage of people do you think actually do mitzvot for that reason? It's like that's a total new thought for me.
I sure hope the percentage is growing thanks to this evening.
But why? Why does it have to be for them? Maybe it could just be that one's ratzon is aligned with Ratzon Chak Ratzon, and you're doing it because it's the right thing. Why does it have to be to transform
Letov
myself?
Letov lach. This is for your good. And it's not because you're some kind of egotist who wants to do everything for your own good. Because the Torah is the good. Ki lekach tov natati lachem. I have given you good teaching. The Torah represents the good.
It is
and
good.
the effect of Torah should be transforming you, me, everyone into being part of the good. And if it only has the effect of point-wise, I do a good deed, then on some plane, I'm not going to say that's irrelevant. Of course, that's very important, but we've missed the ultimate point. Because again, I'm going to reiterate again that message of study is greater, not if it leads to deed, not when it leads to deed, not insofar as it leads to deed, but because it leads to deed. Because ultimately, the real impact that I will have on the world through Torah, and I can express that in the converse as the real impact that Torah will have on the world through me is not by this point-wise good deed that I have done because I studied Torah, but because I have become a different person and everything that I do is going to be transformed because of Torah. If we haven't gotten there, I'm not going to say we haven't gotten anywhere, because you're right, that point-wise good deed will have a point-wise good effect. But we've gotten very little.
No, I
Torah
think
is
it
to
really,
transform
really
the
does
world.
that. Okay,
So,
I'll roll it around my brain a little bit more. I was like,
okay, but again, the role
okay.
of Torah is to transform the world, not merely because there's a good deed here, a good deed there, but because through Torah we have become different people. We have become transformed.
No, that part is clear to me.
Okay.
Like viscerally, but anyway, okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for making me clarify that. Anyone else?
Just with respect to the Ramban on Kedoshim Tihiyu,
Yes.
I'm just wondering the extent to which the examples he gives of kind of overindulging sensually, does that fit into the category of morality, or is that a different category?
I think ultimately it is indeed more than merely a question of morality. That's why I'm categorizing it as the guide to transcendent godliness. There's Kedoshim to you, Ki Kadosh Ani Hashem, is not merely becoming moral, it's becoming godly.
So what I meant was that his starting point, because it struck me as you were discussing the different sources that the source in the Vasisa Ayashav Hatov, the what you were calling out the points on the graph, you know, so with Vasisa Vayashav Atov, it's what I might call classic morality. Making sure not to steal from your friend, not to
Indeed.
kill him, and so on. The starting point in Vayikra, your test, is you could be keeping the Torah, but you could be overindulging your senses and still be keeping the Torah, but you have to go a step further and not be novel, but just have Torah. I'm just wondering if that starting point is different to the starting point in Vasisa Vayashav Atov.
I definitely think it is. In that, again, Vasida Yashav Atov is something that we can only understand on the level of an interpersonal relationship, and in that vein, in the sense, indeed, of classic morality. Whereas not being overindulgent also pertains to a domain in which I'm alone in the room and no one else is there. Certainly, when we speak of a sexual relationship between two consensual adults, then where is there a moral impediment? But if one is viewing life merely in terms of carnal indulgence, then there's a problem when I appreciate that Kedoshim to you, Purushim Hiyu, to be parush, to separate oneself from such a level of worldly indulgence, because I'm appealing to a level of transcendent godliness. So I wouldn't regard that as merely an extension of the comment of Ramban vis-a-vis Asita Yashav Atov, because that indeed is just being moral. Draw the graph, so to speak, beyond merely the quantifiable imperatives of moral conduct to have an attitude towards being moral. And here it's taking the gamut of mitzvot and drawing the graph to give you an attitude towards becoming godly, not just becoming moral.
Right. So it's two different. It seems like the starting point are kind of numbers 1 and 2 on the list you gave right at the end, where number 1 is completely kind of immoral, and number 2 is kind of amoral. Would that be fair, or not? Not really.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. Look, I mean, it's true. I will note that to the extent that an individual views life purely in terms of indulgence, he's also not going to be able to actualize his intellectual potential. This is something that impelled the Greek philosophers to eschew a life of sensual gratification, because of the appreciation that asceticism was key to being focused on matters of the intellect and not being distracted by other things. So I definitely will agree that the individual who engages in a life of reckless indulgence is not functioning as a human being. But simultaneously, we appreciate that the imperative of Kedoshim to you is more to than merely heed the guidance of the philosopher in embracing an ascetic course in order to attain this intellectual goal. And where do I draw the line of distinction? Ultimately, the line of distinction is to be drawn in that for the philosophers, there wasn't anything that was of intrinsic value in not becoming distracted. It was merely a utilitarian endeavor for the goal of becoming an intellectual. Whereas, obviously, when the Torah imposes upon us a code of conduct, and especially when it tells us, Kedoshim to you, ki kadosh ani Hashem, it's telling us that there is significance in and of the acts themselves in engendering in us a level of godliness that goes beyond merely not being distracted because we are endowed with an intellect. And that ultimately is definitely the way we understand Kedoshim to you. And especially the reasoning given in the Torah, that pertains to Kivyachol, HaKadosh Baruch Hu being Kadosh. In other words, it's a route to godliness, not merely a route to the intellect.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone
I
else?
did have one. I did have one other question. Again, I don't want to steal the floor, but so in terms of this imperative to become godly, this might play into the topic you wanted to do tonight. But what about non-Jews? They also are in this world and want to become godly, and we've got this wonderful system called the Torah. What about them?
Certainly, there isn't any impediment on anyone who seeks to come closer to God. And as I have on many occasions told non-Jews, the Noachide covenant is not to be construed as a ceiling, it's a foundation, and there's no limit to the extent to which an individual can imbue one's life with spirituality and striving to come closer to God without becoming Jewish. Simultaneously, I'm reminded of a story related by Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, Zichrono Livracha, who described an occasion on which he was presiding in a Beit Din, and a woman came before the court who sought to convert. Obviously, she was already well into the process. And Rabbi Wurzburger said to her, but don't you appreciate that in our belief, you don't have to be Jewish in order to attain salvation, that the pious of the nations also have a share in everlasting life? So you also have a share in the world to come, even without becoming Jewish. And her response was, yes, Rabbi, I know that, but I'm not talking about the world to come, I'm talking about this world. In other words, to that extent, we do indeed concede that apropos of the final Mishnah in Tractate Makot, the Holy and Blessed be He bestowed upon us merit by giving us Torah and mitzvot in abundant measure. It makes things easier. That doesn't preclude from anyone attaining merit and coming closer to God. Torah is a facilitator in our doing so. Now, if you ask, so why don't we impose it upon others? Of course, the answer is self-evident, because the giving of the Torah begins at Sinai. The first words of the Decalogue, I am God your Lord who brought you forth from the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. It is the experience of the Exodus and everything attendant to it that serves as the basis that connects us with the Torah. You can't impose that on anyone who did not have that experience. If we ask the additional question, okay, so why did only Israel have that experience and not the entire world? This, of course, is a more complex question. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi addresses that question, the realization that there is, on some plane, a hierarchy of existence. We don't expect the entire world to be focusing on that and functioning on that level. So Torah is not something that's going to be incumbent upon the entire world. But simultaneously, I'll note the comment of Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in his commentary on Tehillim on Psalm 25, where, for linguistic reasons, which we won't discuss at the moment, he cites Yeshayahu, chapter 2, verse 3, והלכו עמים רבים ואמרו לכו ונעלה להר השם אל בית אלוקי יעקב ויראנו מדרכיו ונלכה באורחותיו. And many peoples will go and say, let us ascend to the mountain of God, to the house of the God of Yaakov, and he will teach us of his ways, derachim, and we will go in his paths, orachim. And Rav Hirsch, in character, explores the different connotations of derech and orach, and concludes that derech is a kind of all-encompassing Weltanschauung, a way. And in that vein, the solicitation of the nations of the world is v'yorenu miderachav. He will instruct us of his ways, because not all of those ways are going to be germane for everyone on earth. There are definitely significant aspects of those ways that are incumbent upon Israel, because Israel has a unique charge to be light of the nations, to be the kingdom of priests, just as the Kohanim, the priests, have a whole set of mitzvot as detailed in Vayikra, Perek Kaf Aleph, the beginning of Parashat Emor, the various mitzvot that are unique to the priests, Leviticus chapter 21. So too, there are mitzvot that are unique to Israel, because Israel has this charge to be the priests, the teachers of the world. And as a result, v'yorenu midrachav. But simultaneously, orach, he links with a code of etiquette, appropriate interpersonal conduct. And to that extent, v'nelcha be'orechotav. We will go in his paths. In the Orachim, we will go without limitation, because we'll recognize that this needs to be a system of universal decency, that the entire world will learn from the Torah. And indeed, there can legitimately be that distinction. That is, we certainly aren't going to regard the entire Torah as incumbent upon the nations of the world, but simultaneously, if you ask, can non-Jews keep the mitzvot? The bottom line that it emerges in Hilchot Melachim, chapter 9, is the answer is yes. That is, there are two ostensible exceptions, but they both have caveats on them. The two exceptions are keeping Shabbat and study of Torah. And with respect to keeping Shabbat, so Rambam emphasizes that the problem with a Gentile keeping Shabbat is it could be tantamount to chidush dat, to concocting a new religion. Because if you make a day of rest, that's making a new religion. That's something that is a religious institution. And as I know I've shared with many of you on, I think, multiple occasions, Moreno Rabbeinu Rav Avigdor Nebetzal Shlita has told me explicitly that in as much as chidush dat, concocting in the religion, presumes a code of conduct that is obligatory, because a religion is by definition obligatory. If a non-Jew says he's keeping Shabbat as a votive act and not as an obligation, no problem. I asked him, is that only on a one-time basis? He said, no, we can do it every week, as long as they see it not as an obligation. In other words, if a non-Jew even wants to keep Shabbat on a regular basis, as long as he concedes that he's not obligated to keep Shabbat, fine. And with respect to study of Torah, of course, this is something that is the subject of venerable discussion going back to the earlier Vedic commentators with respect to the various licenses that exist for a non-Jew who feels committed to studying the Torah as the Word of God, not as some kind of academic discipline, to engage in studying the Word of God as the Word of God. And the Miri is extremely expansive in his latitude for the Gentile who wishes to study Torah on that plane being allowed and even encouraged to do so. And again, of course, with respect to all the rest of the mitzvot, no, they're not obligations for the rest of the world. And it's important for people to draw that distinction between that which is obligatory and that which is not. But simultaneously, we don't draw a hard line and say, you're not allowed to do this. There's no such thing. And it's important to emphasize that point, even again, as we will stress that even without the mitzvot, there's no limit on the extent to which an individual can strive to come closer to God. And on some plane, everyone indeed is enjoined to strive to do so to the best of his ability. Of course, this is a longer discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, so I think we should adjourn at this point. I certainly don't want to try your patience. Thank you very much for engaging in this discussion.